Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd, and the King Gizzard album Nonagon Infinity is turning 10 this year. 10 whole years of what, in my opinion, is one of the best psych and garage albums of all time, and a really important landmark album for one of the most influential bands in the psych underground today. So I figured what better time to go back, revisit the record, and have an in-depth conversation about its sound, its impact, how it shapes up in comparison to other King Gizzard records, especially ones that have been dropped in the wake of that album. And I thought the best person to have a conversation with for this video was fellow King Gizzard fanatic Isabel Glasgow, who is a music writer, a music photographer, who has actually seen King Gizzard perform 47 times. Dang, that's a lot of giz. Okay, and as promised, here we are with Isabel for this Nonagon Infinity conversation. Thank you for taking the time and coming on.
Thank you for having me on.
You are one of the biggest King Giz fanatics that I know online, whose work I appreciate and have been aware of for quite a while now. But you know, what I don't know is like how you sort of started with the band, where your fandom sort of began. And I figure a good question to ask to kick this off is Nonagon Infinity your first King Gizzard album, or was it like me, the album that sort of like really kind of sparked that interest in you for them?
Yeah, so I actually got into King Gizzard after Nonagon Infinity came out. It was summer 2018. I was in my fourth year of university. I stayed up very late working on an assignment, and I kind of thought, let's just listen to some music and chill before I go to bed. And I went into YouTube wormhole, and I found the rattlesnake video, and I think it was like 2 in the morning, and I was like, this looks weird as fuck, let's click on it. And I was very into like analog green screen visuals at the time, so the visuals really caught my attention, and I just thought it was so wonderfully weird and bizarre. I loved how long the song was, but it never felt like it was lagging at any point. And I just loved how strange it was. And since then, for the rest of 2018, I was kind of like cherry picking different songs from different King Gizzard albums, because they're all so different, you know, kind of getting a sense of what vibe do I want to check out next. And obviously Flying by Crotona Banana is kind of what got me into them, because Rattlesnake was on that album. And I think Nonagon Infinity may have been the third or fourth album of theirs that I listened to. And I remember I started listening to it when I was like really, really tired. And I think about the third song in, I was like, holy geez, I have to turn this off. Like it felt like that scene in A Clockwork Orange where like his eyes are held open, because that record is just so, so energetic. And obviously, I did go back and listen to the full thing soon after, and I think I was just very captivated by how much energy it had and how kind of unique it felt. And yeah, I've been in the King Gizzard cult ever since 2018.
I know you've been a lifelong rock fan, but was King Gizzard a band, or did they bring a sound to the table that you would say at the point that you were introduced to them, you were already like maybe familiar with, even in a tangential way? Or, you know, was this like one of your first bands that was kind of, you know, blending together elements of garage and prog and psych and so on and so forth? Like, was this a sound you were already kind of acclimated to and into?
Yeah, so I kind of grew up listening to almost every genre of music, but rock music was definitely my niche. And I think when I was in high school, I kind of developed more of an interest in the classic psych and garage era. And from then, you know, kind of those like early 2010s garage rock revival bands, like OCs, Ty Segall. So hearing King Gizzard kind of exemplified all of that stuff that I was really into. Around the time that I got into them as well, I was also listening to a lot of punk and hardcore and metal. So I felt like they had that really driving energy and rock edge that music has. And yeah, I think just because they make so many different kinds of music across their discography, with rock really at the center and psych rock as well, they really captivated me because they got the core of my musical interest and the other ones as well.
Yeah, I mean, those are great sort of like artists to kind of come into King Gizzard having listened to and appreciated. Certainly that was the case for me and many artists that kind of came before them and influenced them. But I really do feel like some of those names are like the groups and the artists, given the fandom that there is for garage rock and psych rock among the Australian music scene. Like that really is kind of like laying the groundwork for what King Gizzard was doing on their earliest stuff, and then kind of like building on top of that with all these other different genre influences that come together into this like very chaotic soup of a record with Nonagon. When you sort of got into Flying Microtonal Banana, and you were kind of referencing this a little bit, was it like a really huge, again, intensity change going from that record where each song is like so clearly segmented and, has a very purposeful start point and stop point to a record that, and we can kind of get into this quality of the album, that really does feel like you're sort of in a never-ending maze. I feel like something that kind of reminds me of it recently, going back to the album now, is like I'm kind of reminded of like the Backrooms film that's just about to drop, and sort of like some of those early kind of like, liminal space YouTube videos, because there is a quality about the album, especially as you kind of loop it back into itself at the end, where it kind of feels like there's never an off ramp. Like you're always just kind of like trapped in it so long as you could feel like continuing to listen to it.
Yeah, I feel like that looping quality is something that makes it very distinct from the classic psych and garage that is obviously an influence on King Gizzard, because it's very difficult when you're playing it on vinyl to like run up to the turntable and flip it over in time for it to loop back into itself.
True.
I think that I found that Flying Microtonal Banana had this intensity to it, and I saw that in I'm in Your Mind Fuzz as well. And while I did really like the classic garage psych sounds of Paper Mache Dream Balloon and Gumboot Soup and some more jazzy stuff like on Sketches of Brunswick East, I really was just craving some really driving rock music, and that album clearly has lots of it.
No, it does. And some of the comparisons and similarities that you're drawing from there, it's something I definitely want to kind of lean into a bit, because when this record originally came out 10 years ago, this is something that like we could have never really foreseen. But I don't know if it's something about just how great the album is, or how important the record is in the minds of the band collectively, or how much fandom there is among the band's audience over the years, and the band maybe in a way kind of consciously feeding into that in a way. But it seems like it's kind of proven to be a record that time and time again, despite it not being King Gizzard's first record, not even close to like their first record, but it seems like there are so many ideas, guitar line styles, little vocal quirks, even maybe you could even call them ad libs, the iconic woo, that like you hear on so many songs and so many moments through that record. It's like we hear those reference points uttered again and again and again and again on subsequent albums in a way that they, like some of these ideas just weren't there to the same degree on like previous records. And it's almost like the band is trying to consciously remind you of their past, or remind you of sort of like what it all kind of draws back to in a way. It's almost like a weird inception point where like certain ideas or vibes or sounds were conceptualized that the band is like still building upon now. So I don't know, in a way it becomes like a hyper meta thing that's even more conceptual than maybe the band even devised on the record itself, because like, these ideas of certain sounds and refrains throughout the album repeating and kind of looping back into other stuff. It's almost like even as the band continues to drop new records that explore new territories, they're also looping back into old ideas that sort of like go all the way back to this album 10 years prior.
Right. And I'm honestly very surprised that I haven't heard much hubbub about the 10-year anniversary of this album.
Right.
Not really so much from the band, because, they have so many records. If they celebrated every album's birthday, they'd be celebrating one like every week. But more so from the fans, because King Gizzard fans absolutely love their stats. You hear people say it's been like 52 consecutive shows since they last played this one song. So I think it's kind of a little bit surprising to me that we haven't really looked back on this album too much in the 10th year anniversary. And I think a lot of the narrative surrounding King Gizzard is always, what are they going to do next? Which, is kind of understandable. But I think it's important to do a retrospective of their music, because they've given us so much. And looking back at different albums retrospectively, they definitely change once you look back. I feel like they're a band, especially where their albums kind of grow over time, and you really can see some influence, whether explicitly or implicitly, throughout the rest of their discography from this one record. And I think most pointedly so, is I think this is the album where they kind of really defined what the King Gizzard sound sounds like, even though, they'll put out something that is much more chill or just totally different genre to Nonagon Infinity. Kind of the King Gizzard sound that is a little bit challenging to define, I think really came across on that album. Kind of like wired and oddball, drivingly energetic, very rock and roll, but without, kind of any toxically masculine cockiness that some rock music could have. Kind of more goofy, fun, and free. Definitely heavy on the freedom and eccentricity without kind of being like actively eccentric as well.
No, I agree. And when we first got on the call, we were talking about, just both having gotten off of listens of the record in preparation for this conversation. And I was kind of taken aback a little bit, like I was kind of saying earlier, by how many ideas and sort of like concepts from this record they're still like doing now. It's almost like we don't need to sort of like think back or sort of like have a broad conversation, not to sort of like undercut the purpose of what we're doing right here. But I guess in a way, like, I'm not surprised that there isn't sort of like this broad fandom, like, dialogue going on where it's like, whoa, this album's 10 years old, because it's like the band is still dishing out ideas that sort of like almost like serve as a reminder of this album. It's like we're still kind of like living in the Nonagon Infinity, even if we're not actively going back and listening to the record. Another thing that I thought was interesting about this album is, while at this point we were yet to hear King Gizzard go on the many sort of like very focused genre excursions that like they later would down the road, there are certainly a lot of points where we hear hints of that. Like on the closing track, there are some guitar riffs and passages that do have like an overtly metal quality, and there is like something about some of the music that lays behind those guitars that has almost like a spaghetti western rock rawhide kind of quality to it, which is definitely a vibe and sound they've dove into further. Some of the weird analog droney synth textures in the background of some of the tracks, and the harmonica hits, and some of the bluesy, rustic, backwater, sort of sounds and vibes they dive into on some cuts, is definitely something that like, they kind of put the seeds in the ground for with this album. And then we sort of like saw blossom even further several records down the road. So it's, almost like in a way the band was kind of like laying out some of the ideas and influences they would later be diving into further on this record. It just would take some time for them to kind of go through all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I was listening to Road Train very recently, and I thought this may as well be Off Infest the Rat's Nest. It's just
Right.
as, kind of in that thrash metal vein. Yeah, and I think with King Gizzard, they don't really, I don't think they necessarily look back at this album and try to pinpoint stuff that's on it to put into their subsequent albums that they're making. But I think just because that record sounds so them, it kind of comes across implicitly. And yeah, I definitely do agree that that was kind of the turning point in their discography where they started going a bit crazier in what they would do down the road. I mean, Flying Microtonal Banana was the next one, and that does kind of seem like a left turn, but kind of understandable if you consider what led up to there.
So for you personally, as just a fan of their music, how do you feel like this record over the past 10 years or the time that you've known it, how do you feel like it's aged for you? It's like, is it a record that you still have fun putting on and listening to? Is it a record that you still get a lot out of? Is it a record that you have an easy time kind of putting on and enjoying? Or are there elements about its kind of build and the fact that it is like this kind of almost like never ending kind of continuum of performance? Are there other records that, you have an easier time kind of getting into and appreciating on a regular basis?
I think this record is definitely aged very well. I think there's some other albums in their discography that maybe have not, like some of their like I think KG from COVID, there's some songs I still love on that album, but I feel like maybe that one hasn't aged too well. But I think Nonagon Infinity definitely still holds up as, I kind of don't want to say one of their best albums because it's kind of difficult to compare things that are so different and see what is the best. But I do think it's quite strong, and I definitely think it's held up over time. For me personally, it's not one of my absolute top favorite albums of theirs. It's maybe in the second tier, but I mean, they have so many records, not everything can make the top tier. So yeah, I definitely do reach for this one. I'd say moderately often. I find what I listen to the most by them from the past that I think has also aged well is I'm in Your Mind Fuzz, Infest the Rat's Nest as well. Fishing for Fishies, I think, is very underrated. I was super, super happy that they came back to that kind of like classic rock, blues rock sound on Flight B741. I find I get very engrossed in whatever they just put out. So that kind of takes over my brain until I stop listening to it for a while. And then I'm like, okay, you have like 26 other King Gizzard albums. Go listen to those too. I think Nonagon Infinity holds up really well when it's in part of the live show, both experiencing it in person and also on their bootleg live albums. I find whenever I'm listening to one of those bootleg albums and let's say Gamma Knife or Road Train comes on, I get super pumped. I think those songs hold up very well live, and they actually haven't changed them too much live, which is kind of interesting because they definitely have with some of their older songs. I think one exception would be now their drummer, Michael Kavanagh Cavs, does a really incredible drum solo during Gamma Knife. And I think that really, boosts up the song, especially in a live setting. But yeah, I definitely think I don't see these tracks going stale at any moment anytime soon.
I would say for me personally, it's still very much like a top tier record from them. But I will say there are elements of their sound, or there are characteristics of other records that I feel like they excel on, like the conceptuality of like, Petro Dragonic and Infest the Rat's Nest, and sort of like the linear narrative storytelling that we see on those records. That's something that you just don't get in the same degree on Nonagon Infinity, and the fact they were able to kind of pull those stories and pull those albums off so ambitiously. And while, I think Nonagon Infinity is an amazing record with a lot of great performances. I mean, there is something to be said about the fact that like the continual sort of like connection that all these songs have, and kind of like the looping quality of the record, and kind of everything, kind of reinforcing each other on the album. I mean, there's definitely like lows and highs across the record, but the album doesn't really have sort of like a climactic peak in the same way that like, Rat's Nest does. It's like, in fact, like the closing track and, the final moments of the album are, maybe to my ears, even a little more low key. The record kind of starts off very fiery. It kind of throws you into like this moment of chaos, and it just sort of like expects you to hit the ground running and just like kind of figure it out as it goes along. I mean, if you wanted to listen to it in a way that's like maybe a little bit more easygoing, maybe you could begin with Mr. Beat. And then like kind of start there and then go forward, I mean, it will sort of like loop back into itself once again. But like, if you're kicking things off with the opening track on the record, like you're entering into like a moment of pure chaos, with your pants down, essentially.
I think that's kind of good that it has a lull in the middle then, because at that point you're kind of like, please let me have a tiny bit of a break.
Yeah, they do give you like some moments to breathe for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, I think the jazzy breakdown in Invisible Face definitely does that. And there really is no lull actually in this record, kind of just a lull in comparison to how like high octane everything else was. But so when there is a lull, it's still engaging. And I think that's very important. Like when I was listening to this album for the first few times, I came from listening to a lot of punk and a lot of hardcore, very short, snappy songs. And this record does kind of feel like one whole giant song. So it does kind of take a while to get your head in that headspace of, okay, I'm going to sit down and listen to this like 45-minute long song. But I feel like it does flow really well. And I definitely agree that even while other albums that they've put out since then don't necessarily all the tracks all flow into each other, because of the conceptual storytelling, they definitely have that flow and that momentum. And yeah, it is kind of funny that Nonagon Infinity flows so well, but it is totally far from conceptual. I really like, breaking down the lyrics and music. But with this record, it's just like, I don't know what the hell he's talking about a lot of the time. The first song is about a robot that doesn't stop. The second one's about a big wasp. The third one's about some knife you use to cut into your head. And then the fourth one's about vultures. It's like all over the place. And yeah, I feel like it's funny as a King Gizzard fan, I'll have people, ask me like, oh, what's this song about? And I describe it and I'm like, please, like, hear me out. Listen to it. This sounds very strange conceptually, but I promise it's a good song. So yeah, I kind of love the nonsensical lyrics on that album.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these songs have like a point to make or sort of like an idea that they're building off of, but I see them all as kind of like being in their own little, world or whatever. Almost like I would say even kind of like going back to the cover a little bit, it almost has a quality of being, like a geometric shape and a geometric shape and another geometric shape, almost like a nesting doll sort of thing. It's like just a thing and another thing, but it's all sort of like encapsulated into this never ending sort of like structure that's kind of like built together. And, it doesn't happen on every song, but like on quite a few tracks, you do hear that like repeating Nonagon, open the doors, sort of like refrain. And I feel like that does kind of like serve as a reminder that even if we are sort of like singing about different things on each track, be it like a parasitic person or some kind of like, I don't know, desire to attain immortality or sort of like a better look or something. It's all sort of connected in some kind of way. There's like a connection there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just because like there is a concept, but it's not necessarily super conceptual, that makes it a bit easier to follow. I think for some people, maybe Petrodragonic Apocalypse might be a bit too much to listen to as one of the first few King Gizzard albums you check out. Definitely when I was reviewing that album, it took quite some time to like unpack all the storyline. Like, what do you mean the cat turns into the Gila monster? So
or even records that are like even more narrative, like Murder in the Universe. It's like where and records where you're like literally getting like spoken word bits, and it's
right.
like, okay, this is like so much more about the story than it is the music here.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's talk a little bit about because not only has the band itself grown so much and changed so much over the past 10 years, but like another thing about this album and King Gizzard that you can't really ignore is like, despite the band's relatively like, not an insult. This is not a dig, but like relatively low streaming numbers with respect to some of the bigger acts out there in indie and rock and so on and so forth. Especially with bands like Geese being as buzzy as they are. I think you and I could like both, between the both of us, make a pretty convincing sort of like argument for the fact that like their sound and what they have been doing over the past 10 years has really sort of like made psych and garage like a bit of, a genre du jour for a lot of underground music fans, and has sort of like not, I think, created the inception of certain groups, but like warmed up a lot of audiences to bands like Pond and, a host of other groups that are not only from the Australian scene, but like, from the psych rock scenes broadly across the world. And, I just think there's like a lot of groups and a lot of artists that sort of have a buzz or are getting a lot more play or coverage in certain publications and, appreciation in certain like music scenes that they wouldn't have before, because I think sort of like, a downstream result of King Gizzard being so popular is it's kind of like caused a lot of people who are into them to just be like, well, where can I find more like this? Like how can I find more bands and find more albums that have this kind of vibe and this kind of sound, and kind of diving further into it.
Yeah, I think because King Gizzard is so unique and kind of addictive once you start listening to them. Like if you're a big you're going to want to hear similar sounding music. And when I got into them, they were still on their own label that they ran called Flightless Records, which had a lot of other Australian psych bands. So finding King Gizzard for me was kind of like opening up a door to so many other, particularly Australian psych bands, even bands like Pond and Tame Impala, don't sound too much like King Gizzard, maybe in some places, but not very similar as maybe a band like Frankie and the Witch Fingers does. So I think they really got me into the Australian music scene, and definitely not just me, like so many other Americans, North Americans who really dove into that Australian psych scene. And that was, back around 2019, I'd say. And now it's definitely more, King Gizzard is kind of the top dog of psych rock right now. So
Right.
I think they're definitely influencing a lot of younger bands, which is very exciting to me because I think they really carved out like a niche of modern psych when they really started getting much more popular and putting out more albums. So it's kind of cool seeing how they've already made an impact on new bands starting out. I think a very
And
obvious
they've been doing like their own music festival now too.
Yes, yeah. I went to that last year and it was so much fun. I'm very excited to go back this year. And I think they're really good with having bands on that lineup too that aren't necessarily, very much similar to their sound, but you would like if you do like King Gizzard. So yeah.
And I mean, it's been a really incredible run over the past 10 years, not just for the band, but sort of for the musical doors and trends that they sort of like helped open up and kind of put on with their sound and their advocacy for other bands that sort of like are in a similar lane to them. And it's something that I don't even know if we're sort of not only are we not done seeing, in my view, the momentum of what an album like this sort of like helped put on, but it's like I feel like it's grown to the point where it's sort of got away from them because and we've had a conversation about this. This is part of the reason I feel like we're talking about this, but like Angine de Poitrine, it's like their sound has so much overlap in my opinion with like, not just King Gizzard, but like a lot of their main influences. And, they've through, the way they've kind of promoted and put their music out there have like attained this very surprising, almost like normie leaning fan base that has no concept of who the hell King Gizzard is. You know what I mean? But it's like they're very much a group who I could see like people who are behind the scenes who would put a band on like that on sort of already being into bands like King Gizzard. You know what I mean?
Definitely.
Like being able to put them in a position where they're going to get that kind of exposure. Like, the music nerd class that is already into King Gizzard, like that's who's going to help support a band like that and put them in a position to succeed.
So I think with Angine de Poitrine, they're very clearly influenced by King Gizzard. And I find it interesting because I actually know a lot of people who like them who don't like King Gizzard or have never listened to King Gizzard. So yeah, with that band, I definitely feel like King Gizzard's influence is bigger than their music and bigger than their band now, which is kind of crazy to me because I don't know, like I found them somewhat early in their career. To me, it hasn't really sunk in that they're so big and famous, But I think the King Gizzard influence extends beyond just on Angine de Poitrine. They're a very obvious example. But just the other night, actually, I stumbled across a music video. I can't remember the band, but it was like a young, just starting out, kind of psych garage band. They kind of sounded a little bit like King Gizzard. And their music video, I don't want to say totally ripped off, but was very, playing by the books of the Rattlesnake video. And I went to the comments section and I thought everyone's going to be comparing this to King Gizzard. And I was actually quite shocked because I think it took about the 30th comment to actually see someone.
It had a lot of traffic, a lot of engagement.
It did. Yeah. I think it had about 250,000 views, but only the 30th comment, mentioned King Gizzard. All of the other comments were, oh, because of AI, we have really inventive art like this now. And I thought that was kind of, an interesting take and maybe not one that I don't necessarily agree with. because, when King Gizzard made their rattlesnake video, AI was not really a thing. And I think this kind of like strange, eccentric, very free music has existed and always will exist. And I think the reason why people bring up, AI, they bring it up a lot with Angine de Poitrine too, saying that they're kind of like a direct result of AI existing. We have to make something really weird and authentic. But to me, they just seem very influenced by King Gizzard, similarly with this music video. And I think, in the age of technology and stuff being kind of very formulated slop, very similar to each other. We're going to start valuing kind of more weird, eccentric rock music more. And I think, King Gizzard was obviously doing that for years. So I think their influence is probably going to be more palatable going forward as it already is.
Yeah, I definitely echo a lot of the sentiments that, you've just expressed in terms of like having been super familiar with a lot of the bands that have brought us up until this point. Angine doesn't necessarily like provide anything new or like mind blowing for me. But I think they embody their influences pretty decently. And at the end of the day, like I could at least sort of potentially see the band serving as like maybe a gateway into some of these other sounds. And I mean, as a longtime music fan, especially of like underground music of all types and stripes, I've seen numerous underground movements get like commercially co-opted in a way to where they hit the mainstream in this very sort of like watered down, neutered version of its former self. And while I wouldn't necessarily say what like Angine is doing is like brand new or revolutionary, it doesn't feel like a far paler version of a lot of what is influencing them. You know what I mean? Like it does genuinely seem like, pretty creative. And I imagine like somewhat challenging to people who aren't normally listening to this sort of music. And yeah, to your point, like maybe it is sort of like the presentation and kind of the theatrics of the way that they look that is like making people appreciate it and sort of like give it maybe more of a shot than they would have otherwise. But I'm kind of hoping for maybe a bit more of a net positive long term in terms of like maybe being able to turn people onto some sounds that they wouldn't be able to appreciate already. But I think echoing other sort of like tech issues that we're dealing with at the moment, not just AI, but I think we are sort of in the midst of a moment where bands like them are popping off. And we're also seeing instances of like this music video that you were just bringing up, where, the King Gizzard inspo is so clear and it's so there, but their popularity sort of seems to have been completely segmented off of not just King Gizzard, but like the broader scene that like it kind of came out of. And I feel like that's just all algorithm right now. There's something weird going on with like music scenes across the internet and across the world where I feel like there's a lot less cohesion. And while on the artist side, I'm sure, that band that you just brought up, like knows who they listen to and knows what their reference points are and they know what they're into. But a lot of the listeners they may be getting randomly introduced to may have a complete like unawareness of the world that their music comes from. And I feel like a lack of avenues. Once you listen to that song from that band that you just cited, I think a lack of clues or avenues from that point to go to immediately after to further educate yourself on this sound if you actually did want to know more.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like what I mentioned about how, I got into King Gizzard and then I checked out who else was on their record label and it was all these really great Australian psych bands, something like that. Like how I found them without an algorithm. I just found, well, I guess the YouTube algorithm, but that's very different than
the recommendations and everything. Well,
yeah.
I mean, from my, and look, I'm old. I appreciate and I sort of like presume some of the things that I see and I experience are not going to be, sort of like completely true or completely accurate by virtue of like, me being a little bit more separated from certain segments of culture because of my age. But at least from like my outside perspective and, tell me your own experience here, what you're describing, having stumbled across this band in 2018 and then going down a rabbit hole where you're finding out about all of these like similar groups and something like that, that seems like much less of a phenomenon in 2026 than it does just a little under 10 years ago.
Definitely. Yeah. And I feel like how I, discovered more music, and also like I'm just a music nerd, so there's this too. Just checking out record labels, checking out, who's playing a show with a band I like, checking out KEXP performances, more kind of led by the internet, but more active than just, things coming up on Instagram Reels.
Right, exactly. I feel like that way of kind of like experiencing online content and culture isn't quite as purposeful,
Mhm.
and doesn't feel like an exploration as much as it just feels like, just randomly getting handed what is statistically decided most likely to keep your attention locked into a certain space for a certain amount of time.
Right. And yeah, I find it funny because there's some artists who are, kind of very popular online due to the algorithm, like Love Cat or Jesse Wells. And I found out about them not through the algorithm. So, I go and follow them on Instagram and I'm like, why do I have like 60 mutuals who know who these people are? And no one told me, So I definitely think there is a very obvious shift and a generational one as well on how people check out their music. And like I'm 28. I'm one of those, on the cusp Gen Z millennials. So I feel like the shift is like very obvious and apparent for people my age as well.
That says a lot. That sort of experience that you can have those artists and be into them and know that they have like sort of underground roots, but simultaneously you have all these mutuals that are into them, but they're not getting into them by virtue of the community musically that they come from. It's coming from a totally algorithmic thing. And, I'm not trying to say that, this is not a personal attack against anybody that stumbles across any of those artists in that way. I stumble across new artists that I like in that way.
Same here.
It doesn't make your enjoyment of their music any less authentic, but it does ultimately lead to a sort of like musical paradigm where there is less discovery and discourse and understanding broadly of any of these artists and any of these genres in a communal sense, and it's like all of these different sounds and these records and these genres and these artists are just sort of like existing in a vacuum because there's like no broader education or understanding of the context they live within.
Yeah, I feel like people are less, likely to share songs with their friends too. Like I mentioned, I found like Jesse Wells is very popular due to the algorithm, but I found out about him not that way. And I was like, how did no one send me his song about birds? I fucking love birds. I'm a crazy bird lady,
Mm-hmm.
And I think something like going back to King Gizzard, Field of Vision with its very well curated lineup and very thoughtfully curated lineup as well. There was everyone from every kind of group of person on that lineup. And I really love that, people aren't just seeing other rock bands with just dudes, they have a lot of indigenous people, a lot of queer people, a lot of women. I think when we're not really personally curating our music taste thanks to the algorithm, if you go to like a really sick music festival that someone has put a lot of effort into curating, then you're going to find out those artists. And I think that's great. And I think that does still work in getting people to like new music in more of like a communal sense as well. But I definitely, yeah, I think since I was a teenager, I've seen a dive down from that kind of communal discovery and sharing of music and more algorithm based.
Well, hopefully having this conversation changes that a little bit. Isabel, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about not just music consumption trends, but Nonagon Infinity too.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.
All
I
right.
could
Thank you so
always
much.
talk about King Gizzard.